When you think of voting, you probably imagine ballot boxes, paper ballots, and long lines. But in ancient Rome, democracy looked very different, and sometimes, it literally passed through your hands with a stone. Yes, the Romans voted. But not like us. Instead of voting booths and ballots, they used a much more rudimentary system, though just as symbolic. Stones, tablets, or small marked balls were the instruments of the Roman citizen to exercise his political right or duty. Elections were not held in closed chambers, but in open public spaces, such as the Campus Martius. There, citizens gathered according to their tribe or social class, and were organized into electoral centuries or tribes, depending on the type of vote. And be careful, not everyone voted the same. There were votes to elect magistrates, but also to approve laws, issue judgments, or declare war. Each type of voting had its own method, but almost all involved depositing something physical inside a ballot box. Voters often used small round tokens, sometimes made of stone, wood, or metal, known as tabelli, marked with letters such as V for uti rogus, yes, or I for antiquo, no. In other cases, white or black stones were used to represent approval or rejection, something that the Greeks had done before them. Once they had chosen their option, the citizen passed through a channeled corridor, the pons, and deposited their token in a special urn. All under the watchful eye of designated officials, and the eyes of the powerful who wanted to make sure you voted right. This system may seem simple today, but for its time it was an organizational and political revolution. Rome had developed a mechanism for thousands of people to participate in collective decisions, although, as we will see later, equality was only an illusion. Because in Rome, even when you used a stone to vote, power still weighed more than your token. In ancient Rome, voting was not just a matter of saying yes or no. The physical form of the vote played a key role, and that's why they used different objects that served to express each citizen's opinion clearly and visibly. One of the most common methods was the use of small stones, known as spheruli. White stones for yes or approval. Black stones for no or rejection. Imagine thousands of citizens approaching one by one to deposit their stone in a special urn or box. This simplicity ensured that counting was easier and faster. In addition, the color of the stones made the result transparent to everyone present. But not just stones. They also used wooden or metal tablets called tabelli on which they wrote their vote or simply marked it with a symbol. These tablets were placed in sealed ballot boxes, allowing for secret voting in certain cases. The urns themselves were carefully designed objects. Some were wooden boxes with a slot into which tokens or tablets were inserted. Others had separate compartments for different types of votes. And in more complex votes, several types of ballot boxes were used for different categories or electoral groups. The officials in charge of the voting, called custodians, ensured that no one cheated, that the stones or tablets were in good condition, and that the process was orderly. Although, of course, manipulation and fraud were common, more on that later. Furthermore, to avoid confusion, voters were sometimes required to announce their vote aloud before depositing their stone or tablet. This made voting a public act and, to a certain extent, a social and political display. Although the Roman system of voting with stones and tablets seemed orderly and democratic, the reality was much more complex and much dirtier. Because, even in ancient Rome, electoral manipulation was already a well-developed art. The powerful patricians and senators not only expected the people to vote correctly, but they used all kinds of methods to ensure it. From direct vote buying, to promises of favors and land, to simple intimidation and social pressure. The candidates had their clientele, groups of loyal followers to whom they provided food, protection, and legal assistance in exchange for votes. This network of clientelist relationships was one of the keys to winning elections. It wasn't so much the ideas or proposals that mattered, but how well you could mobilize your customers. Furthermore, public voting with stones and tablets left little room for anonymity. This made it easier for those overseeing the process and the candidates themselves to monitor who voted for what and to punish or reward accordingly. Occasionally, cases of vote forgery, bribery, and even violence at the polls were reported. Voting with stones, although symbolic, did not guarantee a fair election. But the manipulation was not limited to election day alone. Propaganda, speeches, and influence on elections lasted for months, involving the entire Roman society. Although the word democracy comes from ancient Greece, and Rome is famous for its republic, the reality is that voting rights in Rome were quite limited and excluded a large portion of the population. First, only free male Roman citizens had the right to vote. This excluded women, slaves, resident foreigners, the peregrini, and many poor workers who had no legal status. So although the system seemed participatory, it was a very restricted democracy. Furthermore, voting was organized according to a complex system of tribes and centuries. Tribes were geographical divisions, while centuries were based on wealth and military status. This meant that wealthier citizens had more weight in decisions, because their centuries had more votes. In other words, one wealthy citizen could have more influence than 10 poor peasants combined. The system favored the economic and social elite, ensuring that power remained in the hands of the same privileged groups. Furthermore, voting could be costly in terms of time and resources, so many citizens simply did not vote or were unable to do so regularly. Finally, social and political pressure made voting against the interests of your class or your clients difficult and dangerous. So, although Rome had an electoral system with stones and ballot boxes, equality and real representation were far from being a reality. The Roman voting system, although innovative for its time, had serious limitations that ultimately contributed to the fall of the Republic. The combination of electoral manipulation, social exclusion, and power struggles created an increasingly unstable and corrupt political environment. Elections were a battleground where elites competed fiercely, using patronage, bribery, and even violence to secure their positions. Meanwhile, the majority of the population, excluded or demotivated, viewed politics as a power game they could not access. This situation facilitated the emergence of populist figures and dictators like Julius Caesar, who took advantage of the deterioration of the system to concentrate power and put an end to the Republic. In this context, the symbolic act of voting with stones took a backseat to the real political struggles that shaped the history of Rome. Roman democracy, limited and manipulated, was unable to sustain itself in the face of internal and external pressures. Thus, what began as a system of citizen participation ended up being a historic example of how failures in representation and corruption can destabilize a society.